Welcome back to Love in Focus. Help us out by subscribing so we can keep bringing you more stories. The scream of sirens jolted me awake. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The plush hotel bed and unfamiliar shadows disorienting me. Then I remembered Zephyria, our second honeymoon, the trip that was supposed to save our marriage. I turned to wake Michael, but his side of the bed was empty. My heart raced as I scanned the darkened room. Where was he? The sirens grew louder, joined by shouts and what sounded like gunfire in the distance. Stumbling out of bed, I rushed to the window. The street below was chaos, people running, cars speeding past with no regard for traffic laws. In the distance, an ominous orange glow lit up the night sky. What the hell was happening? "Michael," I called out, my voice shaky. No response. I fumbled for my phone, squinting at the bright screen. No service. Of course. The bathroom door suddenly swung open, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. "Sarah, thank God you're awake," Michael said, his face pale in the dim light. "We need to go. Now." "What's going on?" I asked, already moving to grab clothes from my suitcase. "I'm not sure, but it's bad." I overheard some staff talking downstairs. There's been some kind of coup. The government's fallen. My mind reeled, trying to process his words. A coup. This couldn't be happening. Just yesterday, we were sipping cocktails by the pool, marveling at how perfect everything was. Well, on the surface at least. As I hastily dressed, flashes of the past few days ran through my mind. The awkward silences over dinner, the forced smiles for vacation photos, the way Michael flinched when I tried to hold his hand. 25 years of marriage, and we'd become strangers sharing a bed. "Ready?" Michael asked, snapping me back to the present. I nodded, grabbing my passport and a few essentials. We stepped into the hallway, joining a stream of panicked guests heading for the stairs. The elevators were out. Whether from the chaos or intentionally shut down, I couldn't tell. As we descended, the sounds of chaos grew louder. By the time we reached the lobby, it was pandemonium. Tourists argued with overwhelmed staff, demanding answers, flights, anything to get them out of the country. "The airports are closed," a harried concierge was saying. "No flights in or out. We're trying to arrange buses to the border, but..." His words were cut off by a deafening explosion that shook the entire building. Screams erupted around us, and Michael grabbed my hand, pulling me towards the exit. Outside was worse. The streets were clogged with vehicles and terrified pedestrians. Military trucks roared past, filled with grim-faced soldiers. In the distance, I could see plumes of smoke rising above the city skyline. "We need to get to the embassy," Michael shouted over the din. I nodded, clutching his hand tightly as we pushed our way through the panicked crowd. My mind was reeling, unable to fully grasp the situation. Just hours ago, our biggest worry had been which restaurant to try for dinner. Now, we were fleeing for our lives. We'd made it about 2 blocks when another explosion rocked the area. This one was closer, and the shockwave nearly knocked us off our feet. As the dust settled, I saw a family cowering in a doorway, a mother, father, and 2 young children. Without thinking, I pulled Michael towards them. "We need to help them," I said. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. As we approached, the mother looked up at us with tear-filled eyes. "Please," she said in accented English, "our home, it's not safe. We don't know where to go." I glanced at Michael, seeing my own fear and uncertainty reflected in his eyes. But there was something else there too, a resolve I hadn't seen in years. "Come with us," he said, helping the father to his feet. "We're headed to the American embassy. They'll help us all." As we made our way through the chaotic streets, I couldn't help but marvel at the surreal turn of events. We'd come to Zephyria to save our marriage, to reconnect after years of growing apart. Now, here we were, leading a terrified family through a war zone. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, Michael and I had been living separate lives under the same roof. His world of academia and my high-pressure law career had slowly driven a wedge between us. We'd stopped sharing, stopped connecting. This trip was supposed to fix that. Be careful what you wish for, I thought bitterly. Another explosion, this one close enough to shower us with debris. The younger child, a little girl no more than 6, began to cry. Without hesitation, I scooped her up into my arms. "It's okay, sweetheart," I murmured, surprised by how natural it felt. Michael and I had never had children. Our careers always came first. Now, holding this terrified child, I wondered if we'd made a mistake. We turned a corner and my heart sank. The street ahead was blocked by a military checkpoint. Soldiers with grim faces and large guns were turning people away. "No one passes," one of them barked in heavily accented English. "Go back to your homes." The father of the family we'd been helping stepped forward. "Please," he said. "We have nowhere else to go. Our home was destroyed." The soldier's face softened slightly, but he shook his head. "I'm sorry, but those are our orders. No one." His words were cut off by a burst of gunfire. Down the street, I saw a group of men in civilian clothes, armed with what looked like stolen military weapons. They were firing indiscriminately, and people were scattering in terror. "Rebels!" one of the soldiers shouted. In an instant, the checkpoint erupted into chaos. The soldiers returned fire, and we found ourselves caught in the middle of a firefight. Michael grabbed my arm, pulling me and the child I was holding behind an abandoned car. The rest of the family huddled with us, the parents shielding their other child with their bodies. As bullets whizzed overhead, I looked at Michael. In that moment, all the years of distance between us seemed to vanish. I saw the man I'd fallen in love with all those years ago, brave, decisive, caring. "We need to get off this street," he said, his eyes scanning our surroundings. "There's an alley over there. If we time it right, we might be able to make a run for it." I nodded, my heart pounding. "Okay, on your signal." Michael waited, watching the ebb and flow of the gunfire. Then, during a lull, he shouted, "Now!" We ran, our feet pounding on the pavement. I clutched the little girl tightly, feeling her arms wrapped around my neck. Halfway to the alley, the gunfire intensified. I heard a cry and turned to see the father stumble, blood blossoming on his shirt. Without hesitation, Michael ran back, hoisting the injured man over his shoulder in a fireman's carry. The rest of us made it to the alley, pressing ourselves against the wall as Michael struggled towards us with his burden. Just as he reached us, another explosion rocked the street. The force of it knocked us all to the ground. As the dust settled, I looked up to see Michael sprawled beside me, not moving. "Michael?" I crawled to him, my heart in my throat. "Michael, wake up." He groaned, his eyes fluttering open. "Sarah, are you okay?" I let out a sob of relief, helping him sit up. "I'm fine. You scared me half to death." He managed a weak smile. "Sorry about that. Guess this isn't quite the romantic getaway we planned." Despite everything, I found myself laughing. It was a hysterical, relief-filled sound. "No, I guess not." As we helped each other to our feet, I realized something had changed between us. In the span of a few chaotic hours, we'd reconnected in a way that no candlelit dinner or couple's massage could have achieved. The father groaned, reminding us of our situation. His wound didn't look life-threatening, but he needed medical attention. We were all exhausted, scared, and in way over our heads. "What do we do now?" I asked, looking to Michael. He took a deep breath, his eyes scanning our ragtag group. "We need to find somewhere safe to regroup. Then we'll figure out our next move." I nodded, feeling a surge of admiration for his calm leadership. This was a side of Michael I hadn't seen in years. and I found myself falling in love with him all over again. As we prepared to venture deeper into the alley, away from the chaos of the main street, Michael turned to me. "Sarah," he said softly, "whatever happens, we're in this together, okay?" I squeezed his hand, feeling a connection I thought we'd lost forever. "Together?" I agreed. With that, we set off into the unknown, a middle-aged American couple leading a wounded Zephyrian family through the back streets of a city in chaos. Our second honeymoon had turned into a nightmare, but somehow, in the midst of all this madness, I felt more alive and more in love than I had in years. As we moved deeper into the alley, Michael turned to me and whispered, "Sarah, I need to tell you something. A sudden burst of gunfire interrupted him. We all ducked instinctively. "What is it?" I asked, my heart racing. Michael shook his head. "Not now. When we're safe, promise me we'll talk when this is over." I nodded, curiosity and concern warring within me. I promise," I repeated, squeezing Michael's hand. The urgency in his eyes made me wonder what he could possibly need to tell me at a time like this. We pressed on through the narrow alley, the sounds of chaos growing more distant. The Zephyrian family followed close behind, the father leaning heavily on his wife. Their children clung to each other, eyes wide with fear, as we emerged onto a quieter street. I noticed a flicker of movement in a nearby doorway. An elderly woman peered out at us, her face etched with concern. "Quick, come inside," she urged in accented English, waving us over. Michael and I exchanged glances. Could we trust her? But with the injured father and terrified children, we didn't have much choice. We hurried into the woman's home, a modest apartment filled with colorful rugs and the scent of spices. As soon as the door closed behind us, the noise from outside became muffled, creating an almost surreal sense of calm. "I am Amira," the woman said, already moving to help the injured father to a worn sofa. "It's not safe out there for anyone, especially foreigners." "Thank you," I said, feeling a wave of relief wash over me. "I'm Sarah, and this is my husband, Michael. We were here on vacation." Amira nodded sympathetically as she examined the father's wound. "You picked a bad time for a holiday, I'm afraid. Zephyria has been a powder keg for months. We all knew something was coming, but not like this." As Amira tended to the injured man, Michael and I helped the rest of the family get settled. The mother, who introduced herself as Lena, sat close to her husband, whispering words of comfort. Their children, Adil and Fatima, huddled together on a faded armchair, eyes darting nervously around the unfamiliar space. I knelt in front of them, forcing a smile. "Hey there, you two were so brave out there. How are you feeling?" Adil, the older boy, shrugged, trying to appear tough. But Fatima, the little girl I'd carried earlier, suddenly threw her arms around my neck. "I'm scared," she whispered, her small body trembling against mine. I hugged her tightly, feeling a lump form in my throat. "I know, sweetheart. I'm scared too, but we're safe now, and we're all going to look after each other, okay?" She nodded, her grip on me loosening slightly. Over her shoulder, I caught Michael watching us, an unreadable expression on his face. Amira returned from the kitchen with a tray of steaming cups. "Mint tea," she explained, passing them around. "It will help calm the nerves." As we sipped the sweet chai-fragrant tea, Amira filled us in on the situation. The president had been assassinated in the early hours of the morning, triggering a power struggle between rival factions within the government and military. The rebels, long suppressed, had seized the opportunity to launch their own offensive. "The whole city is a battleground now," Amira said grimly, "and I fear it will get worse before it gets better." "Is there any way to contact the outside world?" Michael asked. "The American embassy?" Amira shook her head. "All communications are down. The airport is closed. The borders. She trailed off, her expression grim. I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. We were trapped, cut off from everything and everyone we knew. As night fell, Amira insisted we all try to get some rest. She showed us to a small guest room, apologizing that we'd have to share with Lena and the children. Her husband, Yusuf, would stay on the sofa where Amira could better tend to his wound. As we settled in for the night, the sounds of distant explosions serving as a grim lullaby, I found myself lying awake, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling. Beside me, Michael's breathing had evened out, but I could tell he wasn't asleep either. "Michael," I whispered, careful not to wake the others. "What did you want to tell me earlier, in the alley?" He was quiet for so long I thought he might pretend to be asleep. Finally, he sighed. "I've been offered a position at Oxford." I propped myself up on one elbow, staring at him in the darkness. "Oxford, as in England?" "Yeah," he said softly. "It's an incredible opportunity, a chance to work with some of the brightest minds in my field. But it would mean moving across the ocean," I finished for him. "Right." He paused. "I didn't know how to tell you. With your firm, your career, I know how much it all means to you." I lay back down, my mind reeling. A part of me wanted to be angry that he'd kept this from me, that he'd let us come on this trip with such a massive decision hanging over our heads. But after everything we'd been through in the past 24 hours, it seemed almost trivial. "When do you have to decide?" I asked. "They want an answer by the end of the month." I did the math in my head. That gave us less than 2 weeks, assuming we made it out of this nightmare alive. "Sarah," Michael said, his voice thick with emotion, "I don't want to make this decision alone. Whatever we do, I want us to do it together, like we used to." I felt tears prick at my eyes. When was the last time we'd made a big decision together? Somewhere along the way, we'd started living parallel lives, making choices independently, and just expecting the other to fall in line. "Okay," I whispered, reaching for his hand in the darkness. "Together." We lay there in silence for a while, hands clasped, listening to the chaos outside and the soft breathing of the children nearby. "Michael," I said eventually, "there's something I need to tell you too." I felt him tense beside me. "What is it?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. After Michael's revelation, I knew I couldn't keep my own secret any longer. "A few years ago, I had an affair." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and irrevocable. Michael's hand went slack in mine. "It was brief," I continued, the words tumbling out now. "A client. It didn't mean anything. I ended it almost as soon as it began, but I've carried the guilt ever since. I'm so sorry, Michael. Stop," he said, his voice tight. He pulled his hand away, and I felt my heart breaking. "Michael, please." "Not now," he cut me off. I can't deal with this right now. We need to focus on surviving, on getting out of here. After that, we'll talk." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me in the dark. "Okay," I whispered. The silence that followed was deafening. I wanted to reach out to him, to try to explain, to beg for forgiveness. But I knew he was right. Now wasn't the time. We had more immediate concerns. As if to emphasize the point, another explosion rocked the city, closer this time. Fatima whimpered in her sleep, and I heard Lena murmuring soft words of comfort. I closed my eyes, trying to will myself to sleep, but my mind was racing. How had we gotten here? A week ago, our biggest problem had been deciding where to go for dinner. Now, we were fugitives in a foreign country, our marriage hanging by a thread, with the lives of a family we barely knew in our hands. As exhaustion finally began to overtake me, one thought kept circling in my mind. If we survived this, would there be anything left of our relationship to save? The sound of shattering glass jolted me awake. Sunlight was streaming through the window, and for a moment, I was disoriented. "Everyone up!" Amira's voice called urgently from the other room. "We need to move, now!" Michael was already on his feet, helping Lena wake the children. He wouldn't meet my eyes. "What's happening?" I asked, my heart pounding. "The fighting's moved into this neighborhood," Amira explained as we rushed into the living room. "We're not safe here anymore." Yusuf was on his feet, looking pale but determined. "I know a place," he said. "A safe house used by the resistance. If we can get there?" Michael nodded grimly. "Lead the way." As we prepared to venture back out into the chaos, I grabbed Michael's arm. "Whatever happens out there," I said, "I've got your back." He hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "And I've got yours." It wasn't forgiveness, not by a long shot, but it was a start. The street outside was a war zone. Smoke billowed from burning buildings, and the air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of gunpowder. We moved as a tight group, Yusuf leading the way despite his injury, Amira bringing up the rear. I kept close to Fatima and Adil, shielding them as best I could. Michael stayed near Lena, helping her navigate the debris-strewn streets. Despite the tension between us, I felt a surge of pride seeing him so protective of these strangers. We ducked into an alleyway as a military convoy rumbled past. The sound of gunfire erupted nearby, and I felt Fatima flinch against me. "It's okay," I whispered, stroking her hair. "We're going to be all right." I caught Michael's eye over the children's heads. For a moment, the wall between us seemed to crumble, and I saw my own fear and determination reflected in his gaze. Yusuf led us through a maze of back streets and narrow passages. Every few blocks, we'd pause, pressing ourselves against walls or ducking behind abandoned cars as patrols passed or skirmishes broke out nearby. After what felt like hours, we arrived at a nondescript building. Yusuf knocked on the door in a specific pattern. After a tense moment, it creaked open, revealing a young woman with fierce eyes. "Layla?" Yusuf said with obvious relief. "Thank Allah you're safe." The woman, Layla, ushered us inside quickly. "Father, what happened? Who are these people?" As Yusuf explained the situation, I took in our surroundings. We were in what looked like an old warehouse, now converted into a makeshift command center. Maps covered the walls, and several people huddled around computers and radio equipment. "Welcome to the Resistance," Layla said, turning to us. Her English was perfect, with barely a trace of an accent. "I'm sorry you've been caught up in our fight." Michael stepped forward. "We're grateful for your help. I'm Michael, and this is my wife, Sarah. We're American tourists. Is there any way to contact our embassy?" Layla shook her head. "I'm afraid not. All official channels are being monitored, but we might be able to help you leave the country for a price." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What kind of price?" Layla's eyes gleamed. "Information. You're Americans. Surely you have connections, ways to get our message out to the world?" I glanced at Michael, seeing my own uncertainty mirrored in his expression. We were just a college professor and a lawyer from the Midwest. What kind of connections did she think we had? Before we could respond, another explosion rocked the building. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and I heard Fatima cry out in fear. "We can discuss this later," Layla said sharply. "Right now, we need to move. The government forces are advancing, and we can't let them find this place." What followed was a blur of activity. Resistance members rushed to pack up equipment and destroy documents. Layla barked orders, her earlier poise replaced by a commanding presence that belied her young age. "You," she said, pointing at Michael and me, Come with me. We have a safe house across the city. It's risky, but it's our best shot. As we prepared to leave, I felt a tug on my sleeve. It was Fatima, her eyes wide with fear. "You're coming back, right?" she asked in a small voice. I knelt down, pulling her into a hug. "Of course we are. We're all in this together, remember?" Over her shoulder, I saw Michael watching us, an unreadable expression on his face. For a moment, I allowed myself to imagine a different life, one where we had a child of our own, where our biggest worries were school plays and scraped knees, not gunfire and revolution. Layla's voice cut through my reverie. "We need to go, now." With a final squeeze, I released Fatima. "Be brave," I whispered. "We'll see you soon." As we followed Layla out of the warehouse and into the chaotic streets, I fell into step beside Michael. Despite everything, the danger, the secrets between us, the uncertain future, I felt a sense of purpose I hadn't experienced in years. "Michael," I said softly, so only he could hear, "whatever happens, I want you to know." He cut me off with a shake of his head. "Not now, Sarah. We need to focus on surviving. After that, we'll figure everything else out." I nodded, swallowing my words. He was right, of course, but I couldn't shake the feeling that time was running out, not just for the city, but for us. Layla led us through the war-torn streets with a confidence that spoke of long familiarity. We ducked through bombed-out buildings, scaled fences, and at one point, crawled through a drainage pipe to avoid a military checkpoint. As we emerged on the other side, covered in grime and gasping for breath, I caught Michael grinning at me. "What?" I asked, wiping mud from my face. "Nothing," he said, still smiling. "Just thinking. This isn't quite how I imagined our second honeymoon going." Despite everything, I found myself laughing. It was a rusty sound, bordering on hysterical, but it felt good. "You mean you didn't plan for revolution and sewer crawls?" "I'm disappointed, Professor Thompson." For a moment, it was like the years of distance between us had never happened. We were just Sarah and Michael again, facing the world together. The moment was shattered by the sound of gunfire, much closer this time. Layla cursed under her breath. "Change of plans," she said. "The safe house is compromised. We need to find another way out of the city." "What about the others?" I asked, thinking of Fatima and her family. Layla's face hardened. "They'll be evacuated through different routes. Right now, we need to focus on getting you two out. You're our best chance of getting international attention." As we raced through the streets, dodging patrols and ducking into doorways, I couldn't shake a growing sense of unease. Why was Layla so intent on getting us out? What did she think we could do that her own people couldn't? We rounded a corner and came face to face with a group of soldiers. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Then Layla was moving, her hand going to her waistband. "Run!" she shouted, pulling out a small pistol. Michael grabbed my hand, and we sprinted down a side street as gunfire erupted behind us. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like lead, but terror kept me going. We ran blindly, taking turns at random, the sounds of pursuit never far behind. Suddenly, Michael pulled me into a narrow space between two buildings. "In here," he hissed, pushing aside a piece of corrugated metal to reveal a hidden entrance. We squeezed through, finding ourselves in a small, dark room. As our eyes adjusted, I made out the shapes of crates and old machinery. Some kind of abandoned storage space. "How did you know about this place?" I whispered. Michael shook his head. "I didn't. I just saw the opening and took a chance." We held our breath as footsteps thundered past our hiding spot. After what felt like an eternity, the sounds faded, leaving us in eerie silence. "Do you think Layla—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Michael's face was grim in the dim light. "I don't know. But we can't stay here forever. We need a plan." I nodded, trying to think through our options. We were alone in a foreign city torn apart by civil war, with no way to contact the outside world. The embassy was unreachable, and our only allies were either captured or… Michael, I said slowly, an idea forming. What about your contact at Oxford, the one who offered you the job? He frowned. Professor Halliday, what about him? Could you get a message to him somehow? Maybe he has connections, ways of reaching people who could help. Michael's eyes widened as he caught on. It's a long shot, but there's an internet cafe not far from here. If it's still operational, and if I can remember Halliday's personal email, it's better than nothing, I said. We waited until the streets seemed quiet, then cautiously emerged from our hiding place. The internet cafe was 3 blocks away, but it felt like miles. Every shadow seemed to hide a soldier. Every distant sound made us flinch. When we finally reached the cafe, we found it dark and apparently abandoned. But as Michael jiggled the handle, the door swung open. Inside, half the computers were smashed, and papers littered the floor. But in the back corner, a single machine still glowed with life. As Michael sat down to compose the email, I kept watch by the window. The streets were eerily empty, but I could see smoke rising in the distance, hear the occasional pop of gunfire. Done, Michael said after a few minutes. Now we just have to hope he checks his email and can do something to help. I turned back to him, feeling a sudden wave of emotion. Here we were, in the middle of a war zone, our lives in danger, and yet I felt more connected to my husband than I had in years. Michael, I said, my voice thick, I know this isn't the time, but I need you to know. What I did, the affair, it was the biggest mistake of my life. I've regretted it every day since. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but… He stood up, crossing the room to me in 2 quick strides. Before I could finish, he pulled me into a fierce embrace. Sarah, he murmured into my hair, we've both made mistakes. We've both let our marriage slide. But being here, going through all this, it's made me realize something. He pulled back slightly, looking into my eyes. I don't want to lose you. Whatever happens, whatever we decide about Oxford or anything else, I want us to face it together, like we used to, like we're doing now. Tears spilled down my cheeks as I nodded. Together, I whispered. The moment was interrupted by a commotion outside. We turned to see a group of people running down the street, panic clear on their faces. We need to go, Michael said, his arm still around me. As we stepped out of the cafe and back into the chaos of Zephyria's revolution, I felt a glimmer of hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them as a team. Michael squeezed my hand. Ready? I took a deep breath, nodding. Ready. Together, we stepped into the unknown. The streets were a maze of danger and uncertainty. Michael and I moved cautiously, ducking into doorways at the slightest sound, our hands clasped tightly together. The city we'd admired just days ago for its beautiful architecture and vibrant culture was now a war-torn shell of itself. We need to find Layla, I whispered, as we paused in the shadow of a bombed-out building, or at least try to get back to Fatima and her family. Michael nodded, his face etched with worry. I know. But how? We don't even know where we are, let alone how to find them. A sudden burst of gunfire nearby made us both flinch. As the echoes faded, I heard something else, a soft whimpering coming from the building behind us. Michael heard it too. We exchanged a glance, then slowly approached the partially collapsed structure. As we got closer, the whimpering grew louder, punctuated by what sounded like words in Zephyrian. Hello? I called softly, peering into the gloom. Is someone there? A face appeared in a gap in the rubble. A young boy, no more than 10, his face streaked with dirt and tears. Please, he said in halting English. Help, my sister, trapped. Without hesitation, Michael began shifting debris, and I joined him. The boy scrambled out and immediately started pulling at a large piece of concrete. "Careful," Michael warned, but the boy ignored him, straining against the heavy slab. Together, the three of us managed to create an opening large enough for Michael to squeeze through. I heard him talking softly, then a girl's voice responding. "Sarah," Michael called. "I need your help. She's pinned, but I think we can lift it enough for her to slide out." I turned to the boy. "What's your name?" "Karim," he said, wiping his nose on his sleeve. "Okay, Karim. I need you to be ready to help your sister once we lift this, all right?" He nodded solemnly, and I squeezed into the gap Michael had cleared. The space inside was tight and dusty, lit only by slivers of sunlight breaking through the rubble. A girl of about 8 lay on her stomach, a large chunk of concrete pinning her legs. "On 3, Michael said, positioning himself on one side of the slab. I took the other side, bracing myself. 1, 2, 3. We heaved, muscles straining. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding sound, the concrete shifted. "Now, Karim!" I gasped. The boy darted in, grabbing his sister's arms and pulling. With a cry of pain, she slid free, and Michael and I let the slab drop. As the dust settled, I looked at the girl. Her legs were scraped and bruised, but miraculously, nothing seemed broken. "What's your name?" I asked, helping her sit up. "Zara," she said softly, clinging to her brother. "Where are your parents, Zara?" Michael asked gently. Tears welled up in her eyes. "Gone," Karim answered for her. "When the bombs fell, they didn't." He trailed off, but we understood. My heart ached for these children, suddenly orphaned by a war they had no part in. "We can't leave them here," I said to Michael, though I knew he was thinking the same thing. He nodded, then turned to the children. "Do you know of anywhere safe nearby? Any relatives or friends you could stay with?" Karim's face lit up. "Our aunt, she lives near the old market. She will help us." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than leaving them in this crumbling building. As we emerged onto the street, Zara limping between us, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. We might not be able to stop this war, but we could at least help these 2 kids. We made our way through the city, guided by Karim's surprisingly good sense of direction. The sounds of fighting seemed to be moving away from us, but we remained vigilant, ready to duck for cover at any moment. As we turned onto a street lined with small shops, many of their windows now shattered, Karim suddenly stopped. "There," he pointed. "That's our aunt's shop." We approached cautiously. The shop's sign, written in Zephyrian script, swung crookedly from one hinge. The door was ajar. "Wait here," Michael said, gently setting Zara down next to her brother. "I'll check if it's safe." I watched anxiously as he disappeared into the shop. A minute passed, then 2. Just as I was about to follow him in, he reappeared, his face grim. "The shop's empty," he said quietly. "Looks like it was looted. There's no sign of anyone living there." Karim's face fell. But she must be here. She never leaves the shop." I knelt down next to the children. "Your aunt might have had to leave when the fighting started. Is there anywhere else she might have gone?" Zara shook her head, tears streaming down her face. Karim looked lost, his earlier confidence evaporating. "We can't stay here," Michael said, glancing up and down the street. "It's too exposed." I nodded, my mind racing. We couldn't abandon these kids, but we also couldn't drag them around the city indefinitely. We needed a plan. Suddenly, I remembered something Layla had said. "The old market," I said. "Didn't Layla mention a safe house near there?" Michael's eyes widened. "You're right, it was a backup location in case the first one was compromised." "It's worth a shot," I said. "And it's not far from here, right?" He nodded. maybe a kilometer or two. I turned to the children. Karim, Zara, listen, we're going to take you somewhere safe. There might be people there who can help us find your aunt, okay? They nodded, clinging to each other. I picked up Zara, wincing at how light she felt in my arms. Michael took Karim's hand, and we set off towards the old market. The journey was tense. Twice we had to hide as military vehicles rumbled past. Once, we heard the terrifying whistle of incoming artillery, followed by explosions that shook the ground beneath our feet. Through it all, I was acutely aware of the small, warm body in my arms. Zara had her face buried in my shoulder, her arms wrapped tightly around my neck. The weight of responsibility I felt was overwhelming. It wasn't just about Michael and me anymore. These children's lives were in our hands. As we neared the old market, the sounds of fighting grew louder again. Smoke rose from several buildings, and the air was thick with dust and the acrid smell of explosives. It should be around here somewhere, Michael muttered, scanning the buildings. Layla said to look for a green door with a cat painted on it. We moved cautiously through the narrow streets, every sense on high alert. Karim stumbled, exhausted, and Michael scooped him up without breaking stride. Just as I was beginning to lose hope, I saw it. A faded green door at the end of an alley, a crude painting of a cat barely visible beneath layers of grime. There, I hissed, nodding towards it. Michael saw it too. We hurried towards the door, hope rising in my chest. But as we got closer, I realized something was wrong. The door was slightly ajar, and I could hear voices inside. Angry voices, speaking rapid-fire Zephyrian. We froze, unsure what to do. We couldn't go back. The sounds of fighting were getting closer by the minute. But if hostiles had taken over the safe house, before we could decide, the door burst open. A man stumbled out, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. He saw us and his eyes widened in recognition. "Americans!" he gasped in accented English. "Run! They're coming!" He staggered past us, just as several armed men appeared in the doorway. They shouted something in Zephyrian, raising their weapons. Time seemed to slow down. I saw Michael tensing, ready to run. I felt Zara's arms tighten around my neck, and in that moment, I made a decision. "Wait," I shouted, stepping forward. "We're not your enemies. We have children here who need help." The men hesitated, their guns still trained on us. I slowly turned, showing them Zara clinging to me, and nodded towards Karim in Michael's arms. One of the men, older than the others with a graying beard, stepped forward. He studied us intently, then barked an order to his companions. Slowly, they lowered their weapons. "You are the Americans?" the older man asked. "The ones Layla spoke of?" I nodded, hardly daring to breathe. "Yes, we're looking for her, and for a safe place for these children." The man's face softened slightly as he looked at Zara and Karim. He said something to one of his companions, who disappeared back into the building. "Come," he said to us. "Quickly, it is not safe out here." As we followed him into the building, I caught Michael's eye. His face was a mix of relief and wariness, mirroring my own feelings. We were out of immediate danger, but we were putting our trust in strangers in a volatile situation. The inside of the building was dim and cluttered, clearly serving as both a living space and a makeshift headquarters for whoever these people were. Resistance fighters? A local militia? I wasn't sure, and I wasn't about to ask. The older man led us to a small room in the back. "Wait here," he said. "Food and water will come, then we talk." As the door closed behind him, Michael and I gently set the children down on a worn sofa. Zara immediately curled up against her brother, both of them looking shell-shocked and exhausted. I sank down next to Michael, the adrenaline of the past few hours finally wearing off. He put his arm around me, and I leaned into him, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "What now?" I whispered. He shook his head slightly. I don't know, but we're alive, we're together, and we've got these kids to a relatively safe place. For now, that has to be enough. I nodded, closing my eyes for a moment. He was right, of course. We'd made it this far. Whatever came next, we'd face it together. As we sat there, waiting for whatever would come next, I found myself thinking about home, about the life we'd left behind, the problems that had seemed so insurmountable just days ago. It all felt so distant now, so trivial compared to the life and death struggles we'd faced. I looked at Michael, really looked at him for what felt like the first time in years. The lines of stress on his face, the gray at his temples that I hadn't noticed before, but also the strength in his eyes, the determination set in his jaw. This was the man I'd fallen in love with, the partner I'd somehow lost sight of along the way. Michael, I said softly, whatever happens, I'm glad you're here with me. He smiled, a genuine smile that reached his eyes. Me too, Sarah, me too. As we sat there, holding each other, comforting two orphaned children in a war-torn city, I felt a strange sense of peace. We were far from safe, and the future was more uncertain than ever. But we were together, and for now, that was enough. The door creaked open, startling us from our moment of peace. A young woman entered, carrying a tray of food and water. She set it down on a small table, giving us a shy smile before quickly leaving the room. Here, I said, gently rousing Zara and Karim, you need to eat something. The children ate ravenously, reminding me that I couldn't remember the last time any of us had had a proper meal. Michael and I picked at the simple fare of bread, cheese, and dried fruit, more focused on making sure the kids got enough. As we finished eating, the door opened again. The older man from earlier entered, followed by a familiar face that made my heart leap. Layla, I exclaimed, relief flooding through me. She looked exhausted, a bandage visible on her arm, but she managed a small smile. Sarah, Michael, I'm glad you're safe. The older man cleared his throat. I am Rashid, he said. Layla has told me of your situation. We may be able to help you leave the country, but first, we need your help. Michael tensed beside me. What kind of help? Layla stepped forward. We need you to get a message out, to your government, to the international media, to anyone who will listen. The world needs to know what's happening here in Zephyria. But why us? I asked. Surely you have your own channels, your own contacts. Rashid's face darkened. Our communications have been compromised. The government has blocked all outgoing signals, and they're monitoring everything. But you, he looked at us intently. You are outsiders, tourists. Your message might get through where ours cannot. I glanced at Michael, seeing my own uncertainty reflected in his eyes. We'd come to Zephyria for a vacation, to try and save our marriage. Now we were being asked to become involved in an international incident, to potentially put ourselves in even more danger. What about Zara and Karim? Michael asked. We can't just leave them. We'll take care of them, Layla assured us. We have safe houses for civilians, especially children. They'll be protected. I looked at the children who were watching us with wide, frightened eyes. The thought of leaving them tore at my heart, but I knew we couldn't keep them with us if we agreed to help Layla and Rashid. What exactly do you need us to do? I asked, turning back to Rashid. He exchanged a glance with Layla before answering. We have documented evidence of the government's atrocities, videos, photographs, testimonies. We need you to smuggle this information out of the country and ensure it reaches the right people. And in return, Michael pressed. In return, Layla said, we'll get you to the border. We have contacts who can help you cross safely into the neighboring country. From there, you should be able to contact your embassy and get home. It was a lot to take in. I looked at Michael, trying to read his thoughts. His face was serious, contemplative. "Can we have a moment to discuss this?" he asked. Rashid nodded. "Of course, but please, understand that time is of the essence. Every hour that passes, more innocent lives are lost." As they left the room, closing the door behind them, I turned to Michael. "What do you think?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I recognized from countless late nights grading papers or preparing lectures. I think we have to do it." I nodded slowly. I was thinking the same thing. "But Michael, it's dangerous. If we're caught with that information." "I know," he said, taking my hands in his. "But think about it, Sarah. We came here looking for a way to reconnect, to find meaning in our lives again. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is why we're here." I couldn't help but smile at the irony. When I suggested this trip, I was thinking more along the lines of couples, massages, and sunset dinners, not international espionage. He chuckled, the sound warming my heart. "Well, you can't say our second honeymoon hasn't been memorable." I sobered, looking over at Zara and Karim, who were huddled together on the sofa, watching us with worried eyes. "What about the children?" Michael's face softened. "We'll make sure they're safe before we go, and once we're out, we can try to find their aunt, or look into other ways to help them." I knew what he was implying, and the thought both terrified and excited me. We'd never seriously discussed having children, both of us too focused on our careers. But now, after everything we'd been through, after seeing how naturally Michael had stepped into a protective role with Zara and Karim, it opened up possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. "Okay," I said finally. "Let's do it." We called Rashid and Layla back in and told them our decision. Rashid's relief was palpable, while Layla's face showed a mix of gratitude and worry. "Thank you," she said softly. "You don't know how much this means to us, to all of Zephyria." The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. We were given a crash course in the political situation in Zephyria, briefed on the contents of the information we'd be carrying, and instructed on how to behave if we were stopped and questioned. The hardest part was saying goodbye to Zara and Karim. I knelt down in front of them, fighting back tears. "You're going to stay here for a little while," I explained gently. "These people will take good care of you, and we're going to try to find your aunt." Zara's lower lip trembled. "You're leaving us." "Only for a little while," Michael said, crouching down beside me. "We have to do something important, something that might help stop the fighting. But we'll come back for you if we can, I promise." Karim, trying to be brave, nodded solemnly. "We understand. You're going to be heroes." I choked back a sob, pulling both children into a tight hug. "You two are the real heroes," I whispered. "Stay strong for each other, okay?" As we prepared to leave, Layla pulled me aside. "Sarah," she said, her voice low, "there's something you should know. The journey to the border, it's not going to be easy. There's a good chance you'll have to split up at some point." My heart clenched. "Split up? But—" She held up a hand to stop me. "It might be necessary to ensure at least one of you gets through with the information. You need to be prepared for that possibility." I nodded, trying to keep my face neutral even as fear coursed through me. The thought of being separated from Michael in this chaos was terrifying. As night fell, we made final preparations. The evidence we were to smuggle out was hidden in innocuous items: a tube of toothpaste, the sole of a shoe, a hollowed-out book. We memorized key phrases and contact information, then destroyed the papers they were written on. Just before midnight, Rashid gathered us for a final briefing. "Remember," he said gravely, "if you're caught, you know nothing. You're simply tourists who got lost in the chaos. The less you actually know about our organization, the safer you'll be." We nodded, the weight of our mission settling heavily on our shoulders. As we prepared to step out into the night, Michael pulled me close. "Sarah," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "whatever happens out there, I love you more than ever." I blinked back tears, pressing my forehead to his. "I love you too. We're in this together, remember?" He nodded, then took a deep breath. "Ready?" I squared my shoulders, thinking of Zara and Karim, of Layla and all the others fighting for their freedom, of the life Michael and I might have if we made it through this. "Ready," I said. Hand in hand, we stepped out into the darkness, leaving behind the relative safety of the safe house and venturing into a city at war. The journey ahead was uncertain and fraught with danger, but for the first time in years, I felt truly alive. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. As we moved through the shadowy streets, guided by a resistance member named Tariq, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives would never be the same after this night. For better or worse, our second honeymoon had become something far more significant than we could have ever imagined. The city at night was a different beast entirely. Shadows seemed to move of their own accord, and every sound, a distant explosion, the rattle of gunfire, even the wind whistling through bombed-out buildings, set my nerves on edge. Tariq led us through a maze of back alleys and abandoned buildings. We moved in silence, communicating only through hand signals and meaningful glances. Every so often, we'd freeze in place, holding our breath as a patrol passed nearby or a searchlight swept across our path. Despite the danger, I found my mind wandering to Zara and Karim. Had we done the right thing, leaving them behind? The image of their faces as we said goodbye haunted me. I made a silent promise to them and to myself that we would find a way to help them once this was all over. After what felt like hours of tense navigation through the war-torn city, Tariq held up a hand, signaling us to stop. We crouched behind a partially collapsed wall, and he pointed to a nondescript van parked a block away. "That's your ride," he whispered. "The driver will take you as far as the eastern checkpoint. After that, you're on your own." Michael squeezed my hand. "Thank you," he said to Tariq, "for everything." Tariq nodded solemnly. "May Allah protect you both. What you're doing, it could change everything for us." With a final nod, he melted back into the shadows, leaving us alone. Michael turned to me. "This is it," he said softly. "Are you ready?" I took a deep breath, steeling myself. "As ready as I'll ever be." We made our way to the van, every step feeling like it could be our last. As we approached, the driver's side window rolled down a crack. "Password?" a gruff voice asked. "The cat's whiskers are white," I replied, using the phrase Layla had made us memorize. After a moment's pause, the back doors of the van swung open. We climbed in quickly, finding ourselves in a space barely bigger than a closet, crammed with boxes and equipment. The van lurched into motion, and I felt Michael's arm wrap around me in the darkness. We held each other close as the vehicle wound its way through the city, each bump and turn reminding us of the precious cargo we carried. After what seemed like an eternity, the van came to a stop. The driver's voice came through a small grill. "We're approaching the checkpoint. Remember your story. Good luck." The back doors opened, and we stepped out into the pre-dawn light. Ahead of us loomed the checkpoint, a fortified position manned by stern-faced soldiers. This was it, the moment of truth. As we approached, hand in hand, I ran through our cover story in my head. We were just tourists, caught up in the chaos, trying to get home, nothing more. A soldier stepped forward, his rifle held casually but ready. "Papers," he barked in accented English. With shaking hands, I produced our passports. The soldier examined them closely, his eyes flicking between the documents and our faces. "Purpose of visit?" he asked. "Vacation," Michael replied, his voice admirably steady. Second honeymoon. We didn't know. The soldier's face remained impassive. He barked an order in Zephyrian, and 2 more soldiers approached. My heart raced. Had we been found out? Random search, the first soldier explained. Standard procedure. I held my breath as they patted us down, rifled through our bags. Every second felt like an eternity. Would they find the hidden compartments, the concealed data? Our entire mission, the fate of Zephyria, hung in the balance. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the soldier nodded. "You may pass," he said, handing back our passports. Relief flooded through me, so intense I felt lightheaded. We'd done it. We were through. But as we started to move past the checkpoint, a shout rang out. "Wait!" We turned, fear clutching at my heart. A senior officer was approaching, his face set in a grim expression. "You two," he said, pointing at us. "Come with me." As we were led to a small, windowless room, I caught Michael's eye. His face was pale, but his jaw was set with determination. Whatever happened, we were in this together. The room was bare save for a table and 3 chairs. The officer sat across from us, his eyes boring into us. "So," he said, his voice deceptively calm, "American tourists, caught in our little disagreement. How unfortunate for you." I swallowed hard, willing my voice not to shake. "We just want to go home," I said. The officer smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Of course you do, but first I have a few questions, starting with why 2 American tourists would be carrying this." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small data drive. My blood ran cold. It was one of the devices Layla had given us, carefully hidden in the lining of Michael's shoe. How had they found it? Michael started to speak, but the officer held up a hand. "Please, don't insult my intelligence with lies. We know you've been in contact with the rebels. The only question is, what are we going to do about it?" Time seemed to stand still. In that moment, I saw 2 paths stretching out before us. We could deny everything, cling to our cover story, and pray for a miracle. Or, I took a deep breath and made a decision that would change everything. "You're right," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. "We're not just tourists, we're journalists." Michael's head snapped towards me, surprise evident on his face, but he quickly caught on. "We came here to document what's really happening in Zephyria," he added, picking up the thread of our new story. "The world needs to know the truth." The officer leaned back, a flicker of interest crossing his face. "Journalists, you say? And what truth would that be?" For the next hour, we walked a verbal tightrope. We told a carefully constructed version of the truth, admitting to gathering information, but presenting it as unbiased reporting rather than partisan support for the rebels. We appealed to the officer's sense of justice, his desire for his country's story to be told accurately on the world stage. Whether he believed us or not, I couldn't tell. But as the sun rose, painting the sky outside in shades of pink and gold, he finally stood. "You've given me much to think about," he said. "Wait here." As the door closed behind him, Michael turned to me. "Quick thinking," he whispered. "But now what?" I shook my head. "I don't know, but it was our only shot." We sat in tense silence, minutes ticking by like hours. Finally, the door opened again. The officer returned, accompanied by 2 soldiers. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," he said, his face unreadable. "You are free to go." I blinked, certain I had misheard. "We're free?" He nodded. "You will be escorted to the border. Once there, you are to leave Zephyria immediately and not return. Is that clear?" We nodded vigorously, hardly daring to believe our luck. As we were led out of the building and into a military jeep, I felt a mixture of elation and disbelief. Had we really pulled it off? The journey to the border was tense but uneventful. As we approached the crossing, I saw a line of refugees waiting to leave the country. Among them, I spotted a familiar face, Amira, the woman who had first taken us in. Our eyes met, and I saw recognition flash across her face. She gave me a small, subtle nod. In that moment, I understood. She would make sure the information we carried made it out, one way or another. Our mission, against all odds, would be completed. As we crossed the border, the weight of the past few days hit me all at once. We had survived a revolution, saved 2 children, smuggled vital information, and somehow made it out alive. And through it all, Michael and I had rediscovered each other, our love tested and strengthened by fire. Once safely in the neighboring country, we were able to contact the American embassy. Within hours, we were on a plane home, the chaos of Zephyria fading behind us like a surreal dream. But as we flew over the Atlantic, I knew our journey was far from over. We had promises to keep, to Zara and Karim, to Layla and the Resistance, and to ourselves. "So," Michael said, taking my hand as the coast of America came into view. "What now?" I smiled, thinking of all the possibilities that lay ahead. Our marriage, once on the brink, was now stronger than ever. We had a new purpose, a chance to make a real difference in the world. "Now," I said, squeezing his hand, "we start our next adventure, together." As the plane touched down on American soil, I felt a sense of coming full circle. We had left as a couple on the verge of falling apart, seeking a spark in a foreign land. We returned as partners, survivors, and maybe, just maybe, heroes in our own small way. Our second honeymoon hadn't gone according to plan. Instead, it had given us something far more valuable, a second chance at love, at life, and at making a difference in the world. As we stepped off the plane, hand in hand, I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together. Our story, like Zephyria's, was far from over. But now, at last, we were ready to write the next chapter. The end.